I'll just start recording then, so we can start, and if whoever joins later, I can add. Yeah. Okay. So last time I tried to present the development of this research. I ended up doing such a dense presentation with so much stuff that I scheduled an additional one just to see if I could clarify stuff that was still too dense, too packed. And I also changed some of the stuff that I was presenting based on the conversations we had. This time, my idea was to go back to the original track, right? The original plan was to divide the presentation into 3 parts. So I did 2 meetings on the first part, and now the idea was to move to the second one, right? And actually cover the things that I proposed that we would. It is meant to be the most important one. So in the sense that a lot of the stuff that was discussed in the first presentation was also meant to be a sort of account of things we usually associate with discussing of environments, which like nature and so on. But that wasn't really my focus. I just felt like it is a topic or an approach that already does a lot in that direction. So why not go into that? So propose that distinction between material basis and so on. Right. I would say that these are the 2 things that people should, if they need to remember anything from that presentation, those are the 2 things to remember. This thing that I call the anatomy of atoms, right? Which was like all those discussions about this little amoeba, right? But you can pretty much sum up what was said by these 2 ideas here at the bottom. Meaning, there are 2 things that can happen if you have a process like this, right? That takes X through a process to Y. It can either be a decomposable process, meaning I still have X here, Y here, but I can generate these elements at the middle. I can decompose P into 2 steps. So rather than saying I walked from here to there, I can describe that I took many steps. And that larger description is still part of the same context. Nothing changes, right? We can absorb that decomposition into the original context. Or it is the case that I can't decompose this process. If I do decompose it, I generate parts and steps that are below or outside the realm of the context in question. So if I start discussing, for example, no longer how I walked from here to there, but I start discussing the physiological processes that my muscles went through to fire this or that action, suddenly you lose track of, okay, but did that get you from here to there? You can describe it in a way that you lose the context, the things that you were trying to refine. So there's this weird trade-off, right? In this case, which we're calling logically integrated or regular processes, which is the green process here, you can decompose whatever exists into smaller bits, right? In the cases where you're talking about this material, this orange part here, you're getting to processes that they go below the surface, right? So the black part here, if you focus on this little drawing, which is a simplified version of this, you get the black part, which is just the social logic, right? Which can be simple, like one mode, or composite, if it's a mixture of those modes, guaranteeing the cohesion of the world and constituting how the material basis appears within that world. So the nature, as we call it. Those things which are not totally social, in the sense they're not constituted by social actions, but we are integrating them into the social world. And the orange part here, what's below the surface here, are different non-social processes, which are more or less conductive to the social logics of the world, propagating the traits of that logic beyond the parts and processes that are fully integrated in the social fabric, right? So that distinction between the material basis and the fully integrated social processes or parts, that distinction here is what we used to define nature. as those things which propagate social processes. If you sum them all up, if you lump them together and try to unify them, the name we give to this unification of everything that propagates a social process without thereby being social is nature. And since we're unifying it, giving it a logical unity, we're going to use one of the modes to do it. And that will give us 3 ways in which this material basis or this natural counterpart can appear. As raw material to mode C, as partners to mode A, or as resource to mode B. And then you can get like the composites of this and so on and so forth, right? So the whole presentation was pretty much based on these 2 ideas. First, defining this idea of what is a social atom and how to introduce the idea of a material basis, and then using the idea of a material basis to define nature and many ways in which nature is socially constituted, right? So this is not the focus of what I wanted to present today, even though it is connected to that. I'd say that the previous presentation tried to expand our classic discussions, right? I added a slide here, like, so if this is the classic kind of moments, right, in Badiou's mathematical theory of worlds, right? The transcendental logic, which is the basic logic of how differences make a difference. The phenomenological logic, how parts that have relative coherence across contexts are bound together. The atomic logic, how you can form minimal units out of these parts that allow you to compose objects that are invariant regardless of the context within that world. And then worldly logic, how you're going to relate these objects once they're constituted, preserving their form, right? These are not logics. This is just one logic, but just say like they're moments, right? The way that Hegel perhaps might use the word. What we did last time was to show that we can add a little, kind of make a little addition to what Badiou calls atomic logic, right? He has this idea of a real atom, and we gave a definition of what is the material of a real atom, meaning those parts of the atom which are necessary for its cohesion, but are not fully integrated into the world, right? So my idea today is to make a second addition to this whole schema, but rather than being, let's say, an additional subchapter to the discussion about atomic logic, is an additional chapter that would come after the chapter on relations, right? Worldly logic is pretty much, if you like logics of worlds, is a chapter on relations, the last chapter of the greater logic, as Badiou calls it, right? So we're today trying to do what we could call the greaterer logic, the even greater logic, which is to add the following very kind of coarse-grained or very kind of aggressive distinction, which is this. So what we're first trying to do is to ask, what do you need to add to the theory of objects and objects relating to one another to turn objects into systems? And we're going to try to do this in a way that is following Badiou's theory of, Bogdanov's theory of systems. Meaning a system is necessarily the counterpart of an environment. If you want to remove environments and have systems which are closed, you're actually describing a system with no environment or something like that. But then that's a special case, right? So the thing we want to do is to understand what needs to happen so we can move from this description here from the previous page, right? Objects are relating to objects, and all their compositional structure is guaranteeing that they have the properties that they do have, that they exist the way that they exist, and so on. And we're going to say, okay, but I want to propose an operation, an additional structure, which is compatible with all of this, but which will allow us to derive. So we're not going to axiomatically define. We're going to derive the difference between a system and an environment out of that previous idea. And the first idea that we can use to do this is to say that we turn an object into a system when we use an object's compositional structure, meaning what the object is, so all this structure here below, right, as an interactive filter for how the rest of the world appears. So we're going to say the rest of the world appears to the object under the conditions set out by this structure, right? Why is this an interesting way to approach this? Because this is an asymmetric way to approach it, right? This is a way of approaching it where it reconfigures the world in true asymmetric regions. The system, because we use this structure as the criteria for building these arrows, and the environment whose internal structure is now lost. I'm going to describe this a bit better, but this idea is, let's say, in line with Bogdanov's principles, because nothing prevents us from inverting it and saying, no, I'm going to take this object structure, the first one, right? I can actually do this. We use this object structure, and we're going to see how the rest of the world appears given the structure of this object. Or we can do even a third thing. We can say, no, we're going to take a subsystem, and we're only going to look at this part of the bigger object, and this is going to be our system. And the object itself, out of which this subsystem is part, is going to be included in the environment, right? Perhaps other things will be totally lost to the point that they don't even exist in that environment. The environment is just closed inside this object. So it's totally relative, right? And what we're trying to do is to define an operation that will allow us to take this structure here, especially this here, right? The atomic logic, which constitutes objects, and then the way that objects relate. And recall that at the level of atomic logic, there is no directionality, right? There is ordering. You would say something is inside something else, but you wouldn't say an atom acts on something. There is no direction or something like this. But at the level of objects, there is. You can have an object A acting on an object B with nothing implied in the inverse, right? It's the first place in this whole construction where you start seeing direction in that sense of actions. So this is useful for us. We'll see. So how are we thinking about this? This is the basic idea. So given a world, let's say with three objects like this, right? And they have their relations. We will call a systematization of these objects. So the turning of this scene into a scene that has a system and an environment. The filtering of all arrows between objects through the arrows that come and leave from the arbitrary object chosen as our fixed point. And just for the sake of clarity as we move forward, we're just going to do this type of partitioning here to say, well, A stayed on one side, right? What the fuck am I doing? Yeah. A stayed on one side and everything else stayed on the other, right? So that's just what this means here. And this transformation is the thing that is going to distinguish for us a system on the one side and an environment on the other. So if you look at here, two things happened in this little picture, right? We had like in and out arrows. So green and blue, here this is wrong in fact, right? But in arrows from B to A, out arrows from A to B. These were specific relations between A and B and A and C. And we had relations between B and C as well. What happens after this transformation? First thing is that the arrow between B and C disappears because it doesn't exist for A. A is not interacting with this. It's either interacting with A or B. But at the same time, these are no longer specific relations that happen, just let's say one-time relations with two specific objects. They are now general relations to whatever is the outside of A, meaning the environment of A. If there's only A and B in that environment, so be it. Something has changed. You're now not relating to A and B. You're relating B and C. You're relating to the environment of A. So we want two transformations to happen there, right? This is pretty much, right, how you get as a as a consequence, canonical picture of a system and its environment with input and outputs, right? The very basic idea. And we can either venture, even though, I mean, it sounds to me either something totally trivial or something quite profound to meditate upon, that if this process is really the process that transforms objects, which have all sorts of relations and could have other relations and so on, and suddenly you just classify all, you pick a bunch of these arrows and bundle them here, and you pick a bunch of other of these arrows and you bundle them here, right? What is the property that makes an arrow an input? And what is the property that makes a bunch of arrows outputs? It's not just they're coming to and from an object. Once you attach that property with the second property, which is the environment has lost its arrows, we don't have access to B and C, right? So once you combine these two facts, you see you can actually define an input as arrows of a system are always coming from less structured spaces, right? Meaning if something's being inputted into a system, it is coming from a place where we don't know the structure to a place that we have more explicit structure. And if something's coming out of a system as an output, it's coming from a more structured place to a less structured place in the sense of access, right? Doesn't mean that environments don't have structure. But it's almost like a nice derivation of an intuitive aspect of what inputs and outputs mean. To take an input means not to know very much where things are coming from, right? Just knowing where they're arriving. Well, outputs means knowing something about where things are coming out of, but perhaps not knowing the consequences of it very well. So this combination of factors, right, that we're erasing this and lumping together everything that comes out and lumping together everything that comes in, it starts to, let's say, coalesce or condense or allow us to derive a bit. That's why I say it's between a very obvious thing and a non-obvious thing. I can't really tell. A picture that is, you know, more common picture for describing systems, discussing interactions between systems and things that we already use when we're talking about, you know, lenses, optics, surrogate systems or whatever, right? And in that sense, to summarize, you could say that this operation, which is still to be formally discussed, it's doing three things, right? It is selecting a structured object to preserve, meaning the composition at this level here, right? This whole composition for some object, it is going to be meaningful. It's going to be active. It's going to play a determining role. It is bundling together all arrows to and from that structure into two classes of arrows, right? And it's saying everything you're doing towards the outside. Well, there's a name for that. That's a type of thing. Everything that's coming from the outside to you, that's a type of thing. And this is corresponding, it's almost substituting something that is happening, which is you no longer have access to arrows which are not directly connected to that structure. So the fact that you are bundling them based on, are they going to less structured, from a clearer structure to a less clear structure, or vice versa, it's varying together with the fact that you lost access to that outside, right? So it's not just a matter of, it's what we're doing is not simply saying, take this thing and just do this. If you did this, it would be the same as saying A has relations to B, A has relations to C, and that's it, right? It's different from saying A has relations to an environment, and then you add all arrows that go to that environment and all arrows that come back. So it's a double operation. You need to remove, but you also need to do something to all those arrows and find a way to kind of redescribe them, right? So once you do this, you've moved from a description that has no, I mean, it is situated. You can say, well, A has relations to B, A has relations to C, blah, 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 blah. It is, let's say, it has a place. but it's not situated in the sense that you have a kind of break and you can almost describe a sort of proto-observer, right? And say what is seen from A's point of view and what is not seen from A's point of view, right? Every time we discuss appearances in this theory, we always describe what makes a difference and what doesn't make a difference, right? And we see how the things that make a difference are lumped together or warp the space or something like this. So it makes sense that if we want to start having a theory of how an environment appears, that it would include both focusing on what makes a difference and also understanding what no longer appears, right? Just check something here real quick. Yeah, okay. Does it make sense until then, to that point? Like, is it okay to? Okay. So yeah, this means that once we do that transformation, right, of objects into systems, we can there are three interrelated domains that we need to pay attention to because they define this asymmetric structure, right? This is very important. We're never just doing this, right? This is not the operation. This is the consequence of our operation. Our operation is taking some structure, using it to lump together arrows, and using it to define which arrows it is not connecting to. And the consequence of this is that it is as if we established a break between a system and its environment, right? So there are three interrelated domains that play a part in doing this. The structure of A, because depending on what this object is, what it can do, what it has done, and down the line, if we want to go into more detail, because this is very, very rudimentary, but well, if depending on how A relates to its own parts, right? The flexibility of its parts, the preservation or transformation of its own invariances and so on, this affects what it can do, what arrows can come out of it and what arrows can come into it, right? If I don't have an ear, I can't really sense a bunch of stimuli from the environment. So depending on the organs of this system, you can have some inputs. And depending on your capacities, you can have some outputs. So the structure has a bearing on what you can do. But the other very important thing is the structure of the arrows that are implicated with A. That's the second big thing that is defining this arrangement. And the third thing is the structure of the environment, right? Is the combination of these three things that gives this the system's environment feel. That we are taking this to define this and then losing the structure of the environment and trying to recuperate it via the arrows that are only possible due to the structure and so on and so forth, right? The cool thing about that, I'm not sure if it's noticeable by just looking at these three things, is that they pretty much give the grounding for our organizational Trinitarianism, right? One thing we never talk about is why is this triad not applicable to the world of objects? We can't really talk about composition, interaction, intelligibility proper before we choose a system to ask questions of the sort, how is it composed, which will define how it interacts and what becomes intelligible through that interaction, and so on and so forth, right? At a point previous to that, it's almost like every object or the world as such has these three domains, a more mereological, topological aspect, a more type theoretic dash logic aspect, a more interactional way of ordering things and transforming them and so on and so forth, right? This is kind of not localized and not really, everything is that all the time. But that's not really how we use the organizational Trinitarianism. Rarely we simply say there is an equivalence between these things, right? Usually we say one thing conditions the other. I mean, we even say that there is an equivalence, but when you read our examples and things we actually did with this triad, you can see it's always easier to find examples when you're talking about something you have some access to its structure, something you don't know what it is, and you're saying that this structure is going to condition how you interact with that thing, which is going to condition what you learn from that space. So in a certain way, not only would, you know, defining this operation help us to move from objects to systems, but it would also help us to move from Badiou to Bogdanov, in the sense that everything that Bogdanov writes about seems to start here, right? Pretty much from the fact that there is, if there is an organization, that means that there is also the environment of the organization, and that you could reverse the two things. It's just a relation, type of transformation. It's not a substantial thing, right? So this whole thing seems to be also, even if it's clearly not fully developed, it at least points in the direction of bridging those two things a bit better, right? Does that make sense, guys? I'm not sure. I mean, I was pretty happy with this when I saw, okay, that this might be like a natural way to derive, you know, almost like, why is it that the mereological seems to be, you know, first and foremost a problem of the organization? Why is it that, you know, Renzo was producing a weird algebra, sort of calculus of interaction? Why is it that that's the place where it emerges? You know, the establishment of the boundary through the ways you interact, you know? And why is it that, you know, our concern is with intelligibility seems always to be on the side of the world and making the world more intelligible, right? Well, this would explain why this is how it appears, because at this level here, right? Or at the level of this operation, as I said here, this operation is precisely distributing these three aspects. It is saying, well, you're choosing some composition. That object composition is becoming a sort of, you know, transformation principle, a sort of filtering principle for bundling some arrows and forgetting some arrows, right? This also accomplishes something I always wanted to do, because I really hate the idea of input and output. I find them like there's something lost there that should have a theory of how you get to seeing things as having inputs and outputs. Like, why is it that a system appears to have something like a general port that, and rather than a bunch of different relations, and, you know, that are potentially so heterogeneous you wouldn't even call them the same, right? Why would you say, well, humans interact with their environment through, you know, many sensors and effectors? Like, how do you get to the distinction between sensor and effector, rather than just say that there are many arrows in and many arrows out? It seems to me that there is an operation that has something to do with this. And of course, you would need a high degree of specification, a further enrichment of this structure to get to a minimal idea of what an organ is. For example, you can very, very well see that, for example, what we call organs of perception, they have everything to do with recuperating this through bundles of this. I get a bunch of sense data, and I need to have the means to reconstruct relations which are outside, inside, right? So we don't say that the eye interacts with the external world. Like, that's just one part of it. Like, you wouldn't say that the function of perception is just doing this. It's going to take a bunch of these things, going to find invariances and patterns here to say that some type of connection between, you know, the distance between two objects can be captured inside the system somehow, modeled inside the system or something. So there are many, many steps to take from this very basic idea, but it at least gives us the grounding to understand how to move from the very kind of unoriented, very topological kind of world of, not oriented in the topological sense, but kind of, it doesn't have direction, right? It's just a space kind of approach of logics of worlds, to the much clearer sense of interaction and division between the thing interacting and the thing it's interacting with, that we get in all the different approaches from cybernetics, you know, and systems theory and all other crazy tools that we've been using to describe things, right? And it seemed to me fitting that the guy who founded systems theory, which is Bogdanov, we would re-encounter them after that transformation. So somehow it makes sense. But though if I do feel that there's some hand-wavy things to be described here. I'm not sure if it makes sense to you guys, but for me, even at a level of, I don't know, just, you know, images of thought, when I'm thinking about like constructions from this kind of logics of worlds, I always think that an object needs to be, it is, one proposition is at the same time, it has an interpretation at the logical level, at the topological level, and at the algebraic level. It's not like three propositions. It's not like one proposition has a consequence on another field. It's not like that, right? But when you move to this place, that's more like it. Like if you change the way that you're composed, you're going to interact with different aspects in the environment, and you're going to see new structures out there. So then it acquires this if-then kind of structure. So things get a bit more separated than in the kind of realm of pure math. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, would you also say like the move from the first to the second here is also introducing like time into the picture? Right, because there's no, in the world of objects, I feel like there's no real like before and after, whereas I feel like to have an interaction, you need to have a concept of there was a before I interacted and an after state, right?
Yeah, I
Maybe
would
not
actually,
so much for competition.
Yeah, I would say that there are two, I mean, I think that there is nothing preventing worlds from having objects that have time, temporal objects, but it's different. The temporality of objects would be the world time. The temporality of systems would be that intrinsic time that, for example, you get in memory evolutive systems. Like things are composed in such a way that, of course, the decay time of, you know, particles and whatever, all that is constraining, you know, your brain and your being and so on. But there is something like a time of interaction, which is, for example, it's a bit more like computational time, where the time between you do something and you get a reaction is not a time, it's not a passage of time. It takes the transformation to count time, for example, right? There's a lot of people using like this weird resource theories of logic and computation to bring time in as the sort of back and forth, right? And separate it as an intrinsic time, to separate it from just the time of the decay and modification of things, right? So I would say that, I mean, the way I see it, it would be a consequence for, if you have a temporal world, you probably get a different temporality for the system. You can now ask yourself about that sort of thing. Whereas saying that I don't think this arrow is doing this much, you can still have a totally static problem of systems and environments. It doesn't need to be necessarily temporal, right? Though it's a good question, I'm not sure if you guys think that you can derive that much from erasing access and defining something which is now the lumped sum of everything which is not your system, right? I think it's doing less than that, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think maybe it's setting the groundwork for this more discrete picture, because you can have many states, right? Once you have this, maybe time is too loaded of a term, but maybe a better way is to say that the structure of the system may not have many states in the first picture, but in this one, you can kind of move from one state to another by following the arrows.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit agnostic on that, because I do think you could discuss objects as having time. Like, you know, we did something to be, now the world is modified, and then you can notate that, and now you have a different A because of that interaction. You know, degrees of existence can change throughout time, and that makes sense, you know. I mean, our social world implies time and it didn't imply systems, right? You could talk about system, like the process of reproduction or whatever, and take that whole process as an object. And it's a decaying process with things that are, you know, ephemeral and so on. So I think that this can be introduced in different ways because it can be a simpler thing. And I think the next example clarifies this perhaps, because, you know, there is a special case of systematization, which leads to no new information, right? Say that the way we partition A from B and C, C from A and B from A and C, right? These three partitions, they give us exactly the same thing, meaning you don't really lose anything, right? The way A sees the lumped sum of B and C keeps the properties of B and C kind of intact. The same way that if C lumps together A and B as their AC environment, it keeps the properties of those two things intact in the same way that the third option does. So that there is no loss of information or gaining of new structure by selecting different systems. It's ultimately the fact that they are together a system, if you take the three together, right? There is nothing that is being, let's say, I'm using this word a lot, but I like what it conjures to me, like this warping, something that you lose part of the picture, and now you need to complete the picture with only the arrows that you still have access to, right? Renzo and I were talking about this earlier. It's like, imagine I have two people I know. I talk to one, I talk to the other, and they don't seem to know the same information. I tell the gossip to one, I tell the gossip to another, and the second person didn't know the gossip. I conclude in that way that they don't have a relation between them, right? It's different than if I tell a gossip, but when I come to talk to the other, they already know the gossip. You find out that, well, they have a relation between them, right? There are situations in which this type of, I don't have access to the relation between two people, but I can pretty much recuperate what relation they have simply through my relations with both of them. You know, there are two teams playing. Everyone cheers for one team. I agree with my first friend that, you know, that we cheer for one team. My other friend doesn't cheer for the same team as I do. Well, I know that they are not cheering for the same team. They're cheering for opposite teams. So I can derive their relation, and either of them could do the same. So it's not like there is an environment. It's not constituted as an environment. You just get the objects themselves, right? So I'm just mentioning this because now that you said it, I think this is a good example of we're actually trying to introduce very little, right? We're trying to do very little. And one of the cases of this arrow here is the case where the result gives you nothing new. You lose the arrow. You don't know what's happening between A and B. Yeah, but just by talking to A and to B and then talking to C, you get to tell what's happening between B and C, and you get a complete picture. So that if you were in the position of C and the position of B, you would get the same picture, and that's fine. It's solved, right? It is a special situation, but in this sense, there is no environmental structure, right? In the sense that there's nothing to be learned about the environment that is hidden, and I learned through B and C, and that or changes what I feel that B and C are like, right? In the sense that, for example, I talk to B and they're grumpy. I talk to C and they're grumpy, and I conclude that everyone is grumpy today. It's a inference about the environment. It's no longer an inference about B and C, right? Yeah, this actually sounds a lot like ontological time, this kind of thing, right? And it is very much, yeah, now that I think of it, it is, Dennis, you lost the opportunity to bring logical time up. It is very much an example, perhaps, right, of acting on partial information and reconstituting a bit of the environment that you didn't have access to, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the three prisoners, right? It's the A, B, and C.
Yeah, I wonder if there is no environment for the prisoners. I think there is, right? But it is interesting. I mean, just for the Lacanians in the room, the idea of an environment that you don't have access to its own structure, that's what Lacan calls the other, right? And the barred other, the other that is castrated, is just the environment insofar as you've reconstituted constraints. specific constraints interest Lacan, like the Bardone are the material constraints of the other, but it's pretty much that. Of course, we're at a very kind of simple level here. We don't have the means to talk about most of the things that this entails, because for Lacan, you lack an arrow here, and then you constitute a model that completes this, which is called a fantasy, right? This is not, I mean, A is just a mere object in a random world. It's not a human subject with, neuroses. So we would need probably more layers to get to that. But just to say that you can have a kind of trivial situation in the sense that it's special, but it adds no information, right? It's a kind of weird special case. And for most of the cases, the ones that interest us are the cases where the removal of arrows between B and C, for example, right, creates a connection, a potential inference from interactions that you do have, right, to interactions between system and the environment. And here I just created a slightly larger system where you still have interactions with B and C, but you don't have, it's not only that you don't know how they interact, you don't even know with what they interact. They interact with many, many things. You have no means of knowing if all your input and outputs are connected to B and C, even though this big arrow that we defined here, this transformation, the systematization process, it is actually turning our interactions with B and C no longer into just indexes of my relation to B, my relation to C, but my relation to the outside, right? We're deriving a kind of notion of outside from this. This is, let's say, if you think about it, I'm calling it systematization, but the only new thing, right? The least new thing is A. A stays pretty much as it is. So it's more like an environmentalization process than a systematization. System is the stupid part of the equation. The interesting part of the equation is how everything else needs to be changed to accommodate a system with partial information, right? This whole part here is the part that is actually being transformed. That's why it's called environmental logic, right? The logic of, let's say, acting and what does it mean to act in a space that is now constrained by your own structure, right? Which I think it's a non-trivial, it's a slightly different definition of what environment means, to be in an environment. But it is very much the basis of, for example, the classic concept of Umwelt, like Umwelt, right? And we're going to go back to this because we want to distinguish world from environment, right? The environment is like a region of a world, but the basic idea that Uxküll had when discussing environment, the environment for an animal, was pretty much like this. Like if you just look at this classic picture here that he developed, right, is an illustration of how we perceive a field of flowers and how a bee perceives a field of flowers. I don't know why Uxküll thought that bees see stars when they look at flowers, but I do find it charming, right? This kind of explosion of stimuli, in different ways, versus a sort of indistinct lumping of stuff that would be our immediate way of seeing that, right? And this is what I'm calling a warping. Like, clearly there is some invariance that needs to be preserved. This explosions of, certain chemical substances and so on, and that have a lot of intensity and so on, they are totally in the same world as this. These are not separate worlds, right? It's just that we're choosing a different system, a different physiological system. So it's the same, it's still the world of physiology, right? And biological and natural selection and so on. We're still choosing something of the same nature, but it's composed slightly different. So it is aroused by different stimuli, for example. And then when you warp the space around the stimuli that you do get and forget the things you don't get, you get different pictures, right? And this is nicely kind of echoed in the sense that if you look at the way that he devised this, right, you get what he calls the sense net and the effect net, which would be, right, effects and sense, right? this sense of internality. And then on the side of the environment, he has the classic concept of carrier of a feature, right? So carrier of a feature is not the same as the constitution of the existence of a world, because that's totally objective. And we are here on a kind of relational, if not subjective sense, right? The carrier of a feature is like you have A, you have B, you have C. There are so many features for B and C and for A. B is all these things. B and C are flowers and a bunch of different things. But because A is of a certain nature, when A interacts, only this feature here and only this feature here count. And the other features disappear. But if you were to change this, you might get those features back, right? So it's like a second run at the phenomenology that Badiou constructs, but from a situated point of view. Now we have the notion of an observer, very simplified notion of observer inside of it, right? And you can see that even for Uxku, you get the object, which for us is a very complex notion, reduced to the carrier of features and the carriers of an effect on that object, right? And you, in a big black box here, you don't know what it is. You just call it the thing that is not the system, the opposite structure, right? And already a qualification of sense and effect as things that lump together a bunch of different connections and actions and so on.
Yeah, just on this point, doesn't this diagram though look very similar to the one you presented about the social atoms, like in a way that this object is kind of a black box now, right?
Yeah, perfect. We planned that because that's exactly what I was going to say. A really cool thing that you get from this, which is Hegelian in the best of fashions, which is that, well, when we discussed the atom, exactly what Dennis is saying, right? The idea that you have logically integrated processes, those that can be decomposed, and they can be carried and propagated by a material basis, right? Which are black boxed to the world. You cannot take the steps here and push them in here. They don't make any sense. You will lose what makes sense in that world if you do so, right? What is the nice Hegelian twist is that you get a redoubling of the black box with the environment. Because if here you would say, this is a black box and this is open, right, in the sense of decomposable, now you get a black box because you don't have access to the arrows in the environment, which is why Uxku created a schema that you said, hey, this has to do with our idea of a black box, right? But it's different because it's a black box of black boxes, meaning an environment is a space that I can't even tell if it is black box, right? I can't tell beforehand if when I try something out into the world and I get a constraint, am I getting a constraint because there is a logical constraint? For example, I asked somebody to do something for me, to give me money, and they say no. Are they telling me no because they don't have the money or because they don't want to give me the money? Right? That distinction between, is it a material impossibility or just a social constraint or a constraint of the order of the world, it's lost at first. You can't tell apart immediately which constraints from the environment come from within the world, which stem from its material basis, right? So we get a second distinction. It's almost like you get on the one side logic and material, and on the other side, you don't get to see what's the relation between logic and material, right? You can tell it a bit better here because you can decompose your own actions and try to picture them. And you will get some sense of, well, I can go all the way to this point. After this, it's just the material basis of what I'm doing. Whereas when I look at the environment, I can't tell immediately from what I get from my reactions, right? If they're coming from just socially constituted, in the case of what interests us, socially constituted constraints, or if it's more fundamental constraint that even the environment itself cannot change. Right? So what you saw here as, oh my God, what is this? What you saw here, right, is Uxku saying, yeah, I can't tell what's going on here. You can only say that you're putting some things in and that you get some indicators, some carriers of a feature that are, let's say, the input of your input, right? The things that are coming through the sensor. But what's going on here, you can't tell. But if you do like this and you turn the picture around on the side, you will say, yeah, it looks like an atom from our point of view, right? So it's a weird kind of move from a vertical tension between material and social to a lateral tension between material and social, because you can tell where one thing is ending, the other is beginning in the environment. Is that does that go in the direction you were going, Dennis?
Yeah. It's like yeah. One way we could say it's a redoubling, and another way is to say there's like a global environment and a local one, kind of like, which we call the global environment. We just call the world. It's not really environment yet, but it has the same structure, right? Black box and logic.
Yeah, I think that if you could see the whole world, you would be able to tell which parts belong to that world, which parts don't. So, for example, if you could see the whole world of the state, right, at once, you would be able to tell, okay, there are material, natural processes that are not state-like. You cannot draw a boundary on them and cut them and do all the things we discussed previously, right? But an environment, because it is a restricted region, it's not the whole world. Because the environment is just, let's say, always in the vicinity of a system, right? It's constituted for a system, and it lumps together everything that the system doesn't interact with. It just makes it disappear. So you can broaden your environment, but it is kind of a region. It's not a global thing, right? And you can have many environments, because you can have as many environments as you have systems. And I mean, you can say, like, is this arbitrary? Can anything be a system? No, we're conditioning. We're saying if you're not an object of a world, you cannot be a system that partitions that world into a system and an environment. So it's giving concrete conditions for this, right? But then within those conditions, you can have as many environments, and you can even start talking about how do environments glue together, right? For example, our current theory for what is the difference between the world of the living and a social world is that the world of the living probably doesn't need this. It just needs to glue these things together. But it's a hypothesis. I don't know. We could experiment with it better later on.
Yeah, you remember at the beginning of your presentation also you gave the difference between mathematics, physics, ecosystem, social life. Yeah, I feel like wouldn't you say that the first two, at least mathematics, but maybe also physics, would be like environment independent?
Yeah, I think that like classic, like mechanics for closed systems that are, I mean, highly mechanical and so on. They if you can work with a closed system, you don't have an environment, right? So closed formal system could be said in a certain sense not to have an environment. Even though one thing that has been very interesting is to find that there is a really cool use of the distinction between system and environment in linear logic. So there are interesting uses, but you wouldn't say that mathematics has an environment in this sense. But yeah, you need to it tracks very nicely with the Hegelian idea that it's only with life that you get a certain type of individuation, that it's only with biology and so on and so forth, chemistry to some sort, but biology for sure, that you get objects that are isolated or self-reproducing enough for you to pinpoint them as a system and get a meaningful environment for them, So this could lead to that discussion, back to that discussion as well. Rafa, what was the question? Black boxing would be a condition of an object as perspective.
Yeah, I think in a sense you answered when you talked about if anything can enter that structure, and you said only when you are an object.
Yeah.
I think that answered, because it makes clear that it's not a property that is in anything that is inside the world will have that property. It's something that is specific to objects, because objects in their relation to other objects inside a world, right? So in the sense, it seems as if like it's I said object as perspective because you can consider objects like in relation to each other, but I think what you did was a tinkering that what happens when you look at the world through the object, and then there's that division between environment and system.
The thing that I would make a slight difference to separate perspective from system is that, for example, if I have this, right, and I don't have this anymore, you can say that you have a perspective on B and C from A or something like that, right? But it's the moment that you write like this, meaning these are not anymore just arrows to A and B. These are arrows coming from A to whatever is outside. This is part of what makes something into a system and not just a perspective, right? You need to classify all the arrows you're getting outside and all the arrows you're getting inside and so on and so forth. You classify them into two boxes, right? That classification of everything that's moving outside, it's called going to the outside. Everything that is coming in, input. Like the moment that you make that distinction, which is a typification of relations, right? Then you get to a system. And you say, how would you typify this? Is it just because A is either the domain or codomain of arrows? No, it's because you're lumping them based on that criteria and erasing anything else. Then those bundles, they acquire an asymmetric field that is not just a matter of in and out. It's in from a unknown place and out towards an unknown place. And that made it into a system. So you can have the idea of perspective is meaningful, even if you're before this point, right? You could have like something like objects and relations, objects and perspective, which would still be prior to this, and then get objects becoming systems, right? Like I would distinguish these two things a bit.
Okay,
seems like a stronger condition, perhaps.
Okay, so you would say like we can say that a system is a type of perspective.
Yeah, I think a system organizes perspectives, perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, if you accept that perspective is a slightly looser term, right?
Oh yeah, I'm not talking about perspective in any. I'm just like using it as a. But I think I understood the meaningful difference that you described, and I think it makes sense for what I was asking.
Okay, so this is, I would say that the first, like it's like a big property we want to focus when we talk about environments is that they create this redoubling. It's not only that I cannot access my own material basis, is that with the environment, I can't even tell what is material basis and what is not at first, right? The second is that there can be multiple environments in the same world. You can parse out different kind of ways of dividing the system and the environment, depending on what system you fixate on and even the state of the system. So imagine that in time, this system here changes into some other state, right? It, for example, fires, it changes the way it makes decisions, like deliberates. It's an organization, and now it's a different organization. Well, this environment will change as well, right? So for example, if you hire somebody to do human resources, suddenly you'll get a bunch of complaints about whatever, work environment. So now the environment has changed. You can gather more data or a different quality of data, right? Okay. So the other thing that we can now talk about, once we have the idea of environments lost information, we lost access, you can talk about the different quality of places in an environment, because there are just, regions of the environment which are kind of, you learn about them as you interact with them. And there are regions of the environment which are, let's say, coded for interaction, right? Almost like they have a here. Okay, this was meant to be a place with here written, but it just says something like, please connect yourself here, right? Or please read out this little thing here. So they help to organize and to retrieve all those relations that you lost because you're dealing with the environment, right? So these bits of the environment that are conducive to intelligibility or a predictable interaction, this is what we will be calling a niche. A niche is a bit of the environment that comes with structure that facilitates recuperating what you've lost in a way, right? So it's almost like you're here, and between B and C, we no longer know what the hell is going on, but there is here some other thing, which is D and E, and the way that you interact with them is meant to already tell you about these arrows here and other arrows here that you don't know, right? It's part of these objects to make these other arrows available. And a very simple example of this is to think about a person, this little person I just drew here, really stupid person, that is at a crossroads in the street here, right? They can't really tell how A, B, C, and D, these different streets relate, or how far they go, where they get. You can't directly get to that. But if you have also in that environment, a sign like this, right? If you were to picture this as an environment with the person here as S, and all these streets, it's a place that you can investigate by moving around, by walking around and finding out how things are connected and so on. The sign is like a niche, right? It is screaming to you, please interact with me and I will give you more information than if you just walk around, right? So you can only define a niche, you can only define that this is special in some sense, because let's say it's almost like you're here, the little person is the system, then you have A, B, C, D, and E has a relation with all of them, right? Sorry. E has a relation with all of them. So rather than having to do all of this, you can just have a relation with E, and it will tell you a bunch of things about how A, B, C, and D relate. So again, you can have a lot of niches in a world, in an environment, right? And with that idea, I mean, it's not directly connected to the idea of niche, but when you think about, the fact that some actions to get to some result take more time, take less cost, and so on and so forth, it can help to introduce the last crucial concept we need to think about when we think about environments, which is the idea of an affordance. This is the classic definition of affordance that James Gibson proposes. Affordances of the environment are what offers the animal what it provides or furnishes, either for good or ill. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment. So the literature on affordances is crazy. I think in part because a lot of cognitive scientists and people discussing environmental cognition, they love when they can put things in terms of cost and price and things like this. So the problem of affordance is like a great way to do like an economical theory of cognition. right? A big debate on cognitive theory today is the idea that we are bounded animals with a bounded rationality. We have limited cognitive capacity. And we look in our environment for indexes or systems or things in the world that can help us reason, because we can't just reason on our own about all the things that we need to solve. And then the whole discussion becomes a discussion about what does the environment affords you to reason about, for example, to facilitate, to make it viable, right? So I propose this simpler definition, but it's in line with most of the literature, which is affordance is the appearance of a part of the environment as a means for a system. So it associates a value to an object in the environment. But since objects in the environment appear as a function of a system, with the system in question, right? For example, S1 here, the intensity of existence of objects, which is Badiou's term, is redescribed as the intensity of an object in terms of the system's own actions. So rather than saying this object exists, you introduce the idea of exists for. To afford something is to exist with a certain intensity for a certain function of a system, right? So I just propose these two ideas here. For example, if you have a certain system and you want to get to E, you might have to, do these two actions here. You act on C, and then this allows you to act to get to state E that you're interested in, and you get these observations to show that you're in the right path or whatever, right? But perhaps rather than having to walk around to find out all these things, you can interact with the sign post that tells you where all the things that you want to know, including E, are. And it affords you a solution in shorter time, right? But to afford a solution in shorter time is a sentence that only makes sense if you fixate a system, treat the environment as something which is inaccessible directly, and then ask, exactly as Gibson suggests here, the complementarity between the system and the environment, right? In which way are the things that are out here kind of signaling that they are a possibility for an action that you want to take, right? I think that this is perhaps the most convoluted of the ideas, even though it is, let's say, I think the natural consequence of all of holy shit, what did I just do? The consequence of this step. What are you ultimately doing when you move from here? At this point here, what did you have here? You still have existence, objects, and value of existence, right? And what do you have when you move here and you start asking about some object that is here? Well, you're moving from the idea of intensity of existence, like what Badiou writes like this, the existence of this, right? To something we could call like this affordance of X. Like, what does X afford to the system's in and out arrows, right? It's the objects in the world translated in terms of this interest, right? Or of these capacities, or of this kind of possible space of actions and so on. Yeah, Rafa. Find where I was.
Wouldn't you have to, I put a question in the chat, but it's a different thing. But if that is the case, wouldn't you have to like be able already to split the environment?
Yeah.
I think that's I agree that like it's very intuitive, this next move that you did. I agree with you, but I don't think it's very clear for me how this is done, because it's still a bit, it's too intuitive. There's a jump that I'm not
I think that the simplest way of thinking about it is to think you have an environment. You can now interact with it as a system, meaning interact by affecting it or sensing it, which are our two big classes of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
you wanna so under which category do parts of this environment appear now? So what is the form in which the environment appears now that you are a system which can affect and sense things, right? The idea is that the environment appears in terms of affordances, what it offers.
Okay. So can I, sorry, were you going to continue? Because I was going to.
No, go on.
Yeah, because, okay, so see if this makes sense. There's a system. I mean, the system is you have a system and an environment when you do that split that you described, that I think it was very clear, at least for me. And then in a sense, the split makes you not have the, like, B and C are no longer understood. They're not understood or seen as, or they're not considered as different objects, but they are considered environmentally, you know. So when you see that, if I understand correctly, you have like, it's not a, you have the view of that environment, and then you can partition that view of that you can cut that view of the environment, but that does not coincide
with cutting the objects.
Yeah,
exactly.
But while you are cutting from the point of view of this was, I think, why I was talking about perspective, but I not just like, just to recall. But when you are cutting things out, it doesn't coincide. But in that process, there will be certain parts that will appear as affordances because they touch on joints of the objects without being. Is it something like that?
Yeah, I think that the core idea is that once the whole thing is constituted, so environments appear, how do you call the parts of the environment, and what is the coherence that those parts are respecting? The coherence of use.
Yeah.
Useful with regards to an action, right? So because it is everything for the system, right? So that's the I mean, affordance is, I find it a charged term because it implies a kind of idea of purpose. It affords because I have a final goal in mind. And it might even be the case that you do need a couple of more layers to be able to use this concept properly, rather than just a system and environment. But in some senses where you find the use of affordance, it is as a sense, for example, let's say the minimal thing I think you do need to have is something like, it can be a machine. And you can say a machine is built to, one of those little things that is like this, and it has like some things like this. It's meant to kind of go up the stairs or walk. If you give it like a terrain like this, it won't be able to go up. But if you give it like steps, it affords to that system to go up. Why? Because this structure is conducive to this structure. And so you don't need purpose in this. I mean, you do need purpose in the sense that there is like a constraint on what that machine can do. But you could use the term to say, like for a machine that is structured in a certain way, a very bumpy hill does not afford going up, whereas a very kind of stepwise ladder or hill does afford that thing. So it is kind of a measure of possible paths for a system, right? I think that viability, sometimes it's a better term than affordance. Like in cybernetics, they use viability in a very similar way. Viability meaning like you're here, it might be out of determinate kind of machinery or out of volition. It doesn't matter. But for some reason, X needs to get to Y, right? And it might be the case that, through A, you cannot get to Y, but through B, you can get to Y. And then you would say, well, Y is something that B affords you, whereas it's not something that A affords you. So you can have, like, even though I find it easier, as you said, intuitive to think about in terms of purpose, you can already capture some of that idea even before, simply by considering the asymmetry between system and environment, it already implies the existence of objects for the system, right?
Yeah, I think that what you said about the points of where interaction is conducible. I mean, I think there's a point that it's actually like a conductor. No, there are points in the environment that conduct interaction.
Yeah, it goes back to that schema from Ook School that I lost. Right? He calls it carrier.
Yeah, carrier.
A carrier, it has to do with viability, right? Making a path. In Portuguese, it's even more clear. Viável has to do with via, which is a path, right? Yeah. In English, it's lost, but affordance has something to do with that as well, right? Dennis and John, yeah, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out also that this example of the streets and the sign is very similar to the one that I used in my presentation on memory evolutive systems. I don't know if everyone remembers that, but basically, like, if you have a neighborhood and you have like 3 train stations, each one of those train stations, like, you can kind of forget the structure of the neighborhood if, you know, you just need to get from one neighborhood to another. And you don't need to know all the roads and ways to get from one to the other if you know this train stations. So it kind of has this idea of a co-limit or solution to the binding problem field.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, totally. I think that a niche is pretty much like a local synthesis, right? When you enter that niche, it does give you, you know, kind of a streamlined access to something that you don't need anymore to navigate the environment without knowing, you know, constantly having to separate a local interaction with what it says about the environment. You can get this kind of almost like a quick abductive leap.
Yeah. So it seems like almost everything is an affordance to some degree, right? I mean, can we think of an interaction with something that doesn't have some kind of affordance?
No, yeah. That's why affordance is not a niche concept. It's a general concept, right?
Okay.
Because as Gibson says, the idea is that it's everything that is provided or furnishes. The only change from the idea of existence to affordance is that it is offers the animal. That's the only new thing. We added the concept of for once we added the idea of environment, right? An environment is for a system. So the only change is the concept of existence. Yes, exactly. If everything that it provides, either for good or ill. So, you know, poison affords death. Fine, right? It's not a concept that optimizing for the best. You know, you cannot. I mean, just think of money. Like, you can afford poison, can't you? You're still buying poison. You can kill yourself, but you can afford it. It just means it's within your purview, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. It really gives a nice interpretation to this idea of bundling the arrows together, because at the same time that when we move from the global to the local view to the system view, and we're bundling all these arrows together, that's also the time that affordances start to appear, right? Because before that, there's no for, so everything's just
what it is. Yeah. So, for example, I think a good way of saying this is saying, let's say A talks to B, and A talks to C. That's just what it is. But A talks to B and talks to C, and through this, it can understand the relation between B and C. That's an affordance of B and C. Right? The fact that by talking to one person, then talking to another, I learned something about how they relate. That's an affordance. It implies that they are part of an environment and I'm part of a system. Whereas I spoke with one person, then I spoke with another, just that description in itself, without that kind of lumping together, that implies like it's not an inference yet, but it implies a connection between a particular action, right? And updating of the state of your relation to the environment.
Yeah, it's almost like maybe another word. I don't know if I don't want to take up too much time on this, but the word interface seems to be very similar.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, but for example, you would, I guess, because, actually the definition of interface in that sense, of having, like a system with a port, and you can add something here, and it interfaces. This is a comb, and this is a system, and this is equivalent to calling this an environment, and calling this a system, like in CyberCat, right? So the idea of interface as the way that a system is placed in a comb or a bigger board of connections, right, is connected. But I mean, at this point, I see a lot of good words like affordance, furnishing, providing, making viable, possible paths, and so on.
But could I just, like, before John, just one thing? So in that sense that you were speaking, is affordance then like a quantitative value? Because it seems like you can have like zero affordance also. Like, if there's a sign, if there's a sign that points in the wrong direction.
No, that's an affordance.
In the wrong direction.
It's not a good. It's not a concept of good and bad.
No, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
It's a concept of what exists. A sign that points in the wrong direction actually exists a lot. You will probably follow it if you don't know any better.
No, yeah, but what I'm saying is, if affordance is connected to the conducing of the interaction, or not?
Yeah, it's just a possibility in an environment for a system.
So you cannot have different. So how do you differentiate between are affordances differentiable, or is affordance simply the fact that it is conducive to interacting?
No, it's different. Each thing has a value in the sense that it has an affordance. It exists insofar as it can be. I think affordance is just a notion of use, devoid of if it reaches your goal or not. So it's a prior notion of use. It affords you, meaning there is a path that goes through there. So it exists enough for that system because a path goes through there. Is that a good path? Is that a bad path? Is it useful in the sense that you first anticipated? Is it not? That's a secondary notion, right? And of course, you can test it as you use it, or depending on how it's structured. But it's prior to the distinction between, is it going to be conducive to a good interaction, or is it going to fuck the whole thing up? Because there are things which are neither this nor that. They just are not there.
No, okay, so it's an all or nothing.
You can have things that afford you more options, things that afford you less options, things that are, allow you to take a shorter, less costly path somewhere, and things that take you so you can find a criteria, but.
No, yeah, I'm just this is I think what I'm trying to understand. And so when you're talking about affordance, you are not talking about if there's, like, as you said, it's not a matter of being a good viability, if it's costly or not costly, because there's a previous difference between, which is there are things that are affordances and things that are not affordances.
Yeah, there's first that distinction, and then it can have a lot of use, be very costly, little costly, but at least it's in the game. It's part of the environment. It's a possible part of the environment, right? Yeah, I think that's where it would come in. That's at least how I understand it. Yeah, like a part of the environment that can be taken as a means for a system that you've decided. That's enough basis, and then the intensity, the value that it gets, specific value that it gets, then is connected to additional structure. And then if you are highly complex systems, you're going to get like purpose. Is this something that affords you to get to your purpose? At least it seems like, or doesn't, and then you can get more complicated like that. But when you say something like, that little machine I proposed cannot go up this bumpy thing, but can go up the stairs, right? What are you saying not about the machine, but about the parts of the environment, part one and part two. You're saying that this part two here affords something that part one doesn't. Though both are types of affordance, but you're comparing their affordances, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a way of making things appear qua parts of an environment, I think. And since an environment is a more structureless or more inaccessible thing that exists for a system, that's why affordances are for a system, right? They get this sense of it.
No, I think it makes sense. Okay.
So just going to the last part of the whole thing, the idea is that now with all this.
I still had.
Oh, John, sorry, man. Like, yeah, it took for. Sorry, please go.
Yeah. So, I wanted to second what Dennis said. I think interface makes a lot of sense in terms of the literature I've read on these kind of topics, and it also kind of captures, I think, the relationship between like losing information and gaining kind of affordance at the same time. And I was thinking about how this might fit into what I've been reading about lately in terms of like psychoacoustics and the way that we kind of like filter out both a lot of different frequencies, but in particular kind of like excess information in terms of reverbs and echoes and extra dynamics and all these little bits of information that are quantitatively lost in the sense of like we actually lose a lot of data, but in the process we have a much better sense of the structure of the sound. We're able to kind of elicit things like harmonics. We're also capable of like drawing out sounds that mean things in terms of urgencies. Like the ranges of different sounds a baby might make and all the different ways you can detect that depending on your experience and where you are and blah, blah, blah. But I think that that's also an interesting example because on the one hand, like is the very process of drawing that line itself the creation of the interface with affordances, right? Like affordances are what come with that line, or is that like an extra level? And if that's the case, what's the difference or what's the connection between like the filtering and being able to extract more information? Like I think that that's an interesting place, especially to connect to past mathematics that we've gotten into, like filters. Like how do we actually kind of like cut down information that's not relevant in a systematic way? Yeah, so just kind of inchoate, but
yeah, I would say on this, like you know, the first thing we did was to define a structure, to lump together the arrows. That was the second step, and then to see how these warps this environment, which is now has some properties which we saw what they are. Regional, there can be many, right? They are kind of double black box because it's not only that they are divided between logical and material. We can't even tell where one thing starts and the other ends. And then we know that there is one way of dividing regions in an environment, which is based on the niches, which is just saying, you know, it's like envelopes of parts of the environment. And there is another way of dividing environments, which is based on their affordances, which is like dividing the little parts that you can find as we interact with them, right? That's what as far as we got. So so in a certain sense, both these terms here, the niche idea and the affordance idea, they are just restrictions or specifications of this type of interaction, right? We establish the interaction between system and environments, and then we're saying, well, sometimes you can interact with a niche. That means that as you interact with that bit, you can recover a lot of info about the connection between, for example, B and C that you don't have direct access, right? And we have a looser idea of interacting and getting something out of it, which is just the idea of interacting with something which is part of your environment. And that's, you know, the consequences or the possibility of interacting, we're calling an affordance. You know, that environment affords the interaction with B and C.
So we kind of talk about two different levels where like maybe like the filtering out of excess information is at the level of the envelope, but more the almost meaning or kind of like aesthetic comes out more at the level of the affordance, like what a sound might mean in the context of an environment or how one might react to it.
Yeah, I think it's too loaded, those terms. Like the losing of information is coming from, well, if I'm, for example, if this is a human ear, which has a specific range of sounds that it can gather, right? And kind of distance from which you can still hear the air pressure making relevant changes to your ear. So from a very far place, you can't, right? That structure is restricting how you relate to the outside. And this is restricting the data that you can access. So that restriction or making indifferent of some data is not, has nothing, it's what constitutes the field of affordance. It's not a type of thing, right? It's the very constitutive process that we describe, right? We describe the process where this structure constrains these arrows to forget things that it cannot access, right? At that level, I think what you're calling losing information or losing data, but also getting some rich sense of what is left is constituted. And then we're exploring that space. And we're exploring that space in two ways. We're exploring that space in the sense that, for example, you can have a tonal niche where the connection between the notes you're making, they are so entangled with the harmonic structure of the notes themselves that, you know, with a quick notion of, is it consonant? Does it have tension or not? You can already navigate the sounds that you're listening to, right? So those interactions, they carry you forward very quickly. That's one type of interaction with the environment, which the niche is trying to capture. The idea that some interactions might be very conductive for you to learn about the environment, right? And then we have a simpler, more general idea that I try to introduce, which is the idea of affordance, which is once things are constituted for a system, how do we name the way that they exist? Just, it's not an aesthetic. I mean, usually when we talk about the way things exist, you can talk about transcendental aesthetics, right? But it's just in that sense, like things become a possibility for a system. That's just what affordance means. Does it afford something for a system, or was it lumped together with everything that was forgotten once the space was warped and became an environment? Perhaps the moving towards social structures might clarify this as well. I'm not sure, but does that help, John?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, because I mean, now we can just do this now with a bit more content, because in the case of social objects and social environments, right? Our objects A, B, and C, they're complex objects that belong to our complex world with three transcendentals, right? Each one of these objects is already a complex. And it makes it easier now with this theory to use this transformation to explain why, depending on how this object is composed in terms of A, B, and C, it will constitute an environment, and it will get to interact and recuperate some arrows, but not others, depending on this structure. So this is the first step, right? To understand, I think it already facilitates this discussion, because you can start saying things like this. Well, depending on how this object is structured in the world, once you take it to be a system, to be the organization that is interacting with the world, some things will be lumped together and we don't make a distinction. Some things make a distinction. For example, I have a good example that I'm having to deal with a lot now, which is the difference between how quantities of money exist for a company and how quantities of money exist in the humanitarian sector. In the humanitarian sector, you are not allowed, if somebody gives you $100 bill and another person gives you $100 bill, those $200 don't exist. What exists is 100 plus 100, because you will have to make a spreadsheet that keeps those things separate. Because at the end result, when you use $200 to buy water for starving children, you will say $100 worth of water was bought from donor 1 and $100 was bought from donor 2. So you need to keep those quantities separate, even though in a company that makes no sense. You might keep, let's say, a sense of, shareholders have a share of the output, but you lump everything together. You try to, money becomes more money, and then you share it again based on profit rate and shareholder their shares, right? So those are different ways of lumping or not lumping, of separating or seeing parts of your environment depending on how you're structured, right? In the case of humanitarian sector, the logic of the gift plays a weird, perverse, strange role. So donors are seen as gifts, gift givers. So you need to, at the end of the process, returns to them as if they gave a gift. So mode A needs to be present throughout the process, whereas investors in a capitalist firm, they are not seen as, separate persons. That's not an important idea, only in a very different way. So this is just, with all that we discussed, the idea now is that we can use this transformation to give a clearer sense to our classic hypothesis that it takes an object of a certain social structure in order to explore properties of the social environment that are not directly accessible to us. And depending on your structure, you will make some interactions rather than other, right? Meaning the environment will afford you some things rather than others, and you will potentially learn some things rather than others, right? Suddenly I think the idea of affordance makes more sense. Like it connects clearly with that of interface as well. But if you have like if you have a group of people who are doing workers' inquiry, you're going to be private to get information from workers and a certain political base that you then can process and see what it means. If you don't have anything of that sort in your organization, you're not going to get that info, meaning those journalists or militants, they make it so that workers afford you some information, right? It doesn't say if the information is good or bad, what you're going to do with it, but it makes different things light up in the environment, right? If you're structured in some way and you can interact in some ways, right? You might talk about this. Should we, right, take advantage of this? Should we not? And so on. If you're structured differently, some things will simply disappear from the environment. You cannot, it's not simply that I cannot afford it. Like, oh, I wish I could organize conversations with these people, but we can't afford in the sense that it's too costly. It's hard to do it, because even the fact that it's hard to do can tell you something, right? The theory of affordances is very much connected with the theory of predictive processing and cognitive models, where even if you can't accomplish something, you learn something from that failure, and that's meaningful. So wrong affordance still might afford you something, right? Or a poor decision, whereas it's different from simply not seeing this. A small group, we just talk to ourselves. The environment won't flash like for the bee, right? With all these possibilities of things that it could afford given our structure. Yeah, Dennis.
Yeah, just to use another example from psychoanalysis, which kind of combines the two things, right? Is like the notion of repression. It's an affordance, which is also something that loses information, right? Like, how would you categorize that?
I would put repression at the level of relations that disappear.
Yeah, but like it's not just that it disappeared, but for like a purpose, right?
Yeah,
there's a for to repression, which is not necessarily repression is different from
I see what you mean. It's a good example. Yeah, like it's clearly a forgetting that affords you something, like a screen memory, or binding two pieces of information and forgetting a third piece of information. That's being conducive to something for that system, right? So yeah, you're right. It's a good way of showing that affordance doesn't mean a positive thing. Like it just means that it gets caught up in the interplay between system and environment.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting case. I think I don't really know what to make of it, but
yeah, I think you went into one of the most like. Let me exemplify with a very complicated. So the whole presentation was built pretty much under inspiration from this short passage from Søren Mau's Mute Compulsion, right? So yeah, it's what is this? Oh, this is great. I can actually draw this and it disappeared. Oh, this is perfect. Søren Mau tries to pull kind of into the fore what he thinks is an underdeveloped idea from this classic passage from the chapter on primitive accumulation in Capital, right? Where Marx says, the mute compulsion of economic relation seals the domination of the capitalist over the worker. I think seals an important word. Extra economic immediate violence is still, of course, used, but only in exceptional cases. In the ordinary run of things, the worker can be left to the natural laws of production. See, again, the natural here is relevant. That is, it is possible to rely on his dependence on capital, which springs from the conditions of production themselves and is guaranteed in perpetuity by them, right? So he's trying to give this kind of more complex theory of what it means for this dependence on capital to be produced by the conditions of production and to be guaranteed or propagated by them, right? So, and you can see that Marx makes a distinction between immediate violence and this type of mute compulsion, right? And he makes a distinction, of course, that the capitalist mode of production requires violence to be brought about, but then he wants to talk about what is the forms of power required for its reproduction, right? And then he goes into this idea, which is violence is thus replaced by another form of power, one not immediately visible or audible as such, but just as brutal, unremitting, and ruthless as violence, an impersonal, abstract, and anonymous form of power immediately embedded in the economic processes themselves, right? Rather than tacked onto them in an external manner. So mute compulsion, which is economic power, right? And then again, he says, it is no doubt impossible that capitalism would be impossible without constant presence of ideological and coercive power. But there is more to capital than that. Violence as well as ideologies are a form of power that directly address the subject. While economic power, on the other hand, addresses the subject only indirectly by acting on its environment, right? This is the idea here. So, and then he makes the distinction: violence as a form of power is rooted in the ability to inflict pain and death, ideology in the ability to shape how people think, economic power is rooted in the ability to reconfigure the material conditions of social reproduction. So you get a lot of ideas that we now have better tools to understand. For example, when he talks about it's not immediately visible or audible, right? It's not something that happens straight to you, but it's in the environment, right? It constrains materially and reconfigures the ability, right, for social reproduction. So it is rooted in the ability to reconfigure the material conditions of social reproduction. That seemed to me like the basis for interpreting this idea of social environment, right? So especially if we take this idea here that he mentions, violence rooted in the ability to inflict pain and death, and ideology in the ability to shape how people think, you could even make this distinction here. If we go back to a very simple idea, right? I mean, you do need more structure in a system to talk about ideologies. It's not enough the picture that we have here. But pretty much, if you, for example, if we had here a model of the system, which is telling you how to act and how to interpret your senses, right? We would generally associate ideology with things that influence this model, right? The representation of your embedding in social reality is like Althusser's idea of ideology, right? Violence seems to be much more connected with a potential impairing of your capacities, direct to the point of total obliteration of the existence of the system as such, right? And mute compulsion, which he's talking about, has something to do with this thing you lost, with these arrows you cannot access, right? So if you have as we were talking about, you have, for example, a system where you can relate to B, you can relate to C, but you can't really see how they relate and if they relate to other things, right? The fact, for example, that if you substitute this for prices, you get for free the connection with everything else, right? For free in the sense that prices afford you a measure of a larger social space, right? You already see that there's something very important connecting value to this idea of how it shapes an environment. And this is just the simpler form. So I would distinguish where I even added this here. I'm not going to go into it, but there's a really interesting way of describing torture by this thinker called Elaine Scarry. I really recommend her book, which has everything to do with how you manipulate this and this to make a system exist for an environment that doesn't fit it. Yes, Elaine Scarry writes about torture. It's a really, really profound, really, really dense book. I really recommend it. But what I was going to say is that we can then distinguish, at least from mode C, if we focus now just on mode C for a while. So the value logic, we can discern two ways that mode C organizes its affordances, right, for an environment, how mode C environment appears to us. The first, I'd say, it's value, it's the standpoint of value itself. So it's not yet price. Price means that we're going to see affordances in terms of price, like things, can you pay for them? That's a way of the environment being structured and appearing to us in terms of price. But that's not the only way. The more profound way, which is also what Mau discusses a bit more, has to do with value insofar as it is a requirement for the compatibility with other objects in the world. So for example, imagine you have a polluted river, right? You don't know the price of the river. It's not a matter of quantifying it. But once you've polluted a river, no particular person can go there and use it. You can't, you lose a bunch of affordances for that river, right? But it affords a bunch of opportunities, business opportunities for cleaning it up if people pay you enough, right? So you can propagate value affordances, not in the sense of knowing the price of things. It's not like the capitalist environment, it's just covering everything with price. Value is much more than price. Value is just the condition that whatever part of the world you pick, it will remain compatible with capitalist endeavor, right? So you can propagate through the environment things that remain compatible with value. Of course, the simplest way to see this is simply by the fact that you can get like a sort of, I think the concept here would be a niche, right? By the fact that if you go into the price sphere, for example, if you look at what everything is costing, or if you just look at things and look at the tags and things, you get an image of what you can and can't do based on how much money you have in the bank, right? But that's a niche in the sense that I mentioned, that the environment is conducive to that reconstruction, right? So we could say that the capitalist space has a price niche, which is what enchanted Hayek, right? But it has a value structure more broadly, in the sense that, for example, you can transform things in such a way. Another example is, for example, technology, where, you know, like just think it's more on the consumer side, but not necessarily. I was talking the other day to Vitor about this. Like, for example, when you do a strike and you take a factory, you're taking a bunch of means of production that have very specific affordances. Like, you take over a factory that makes cars, you can either sell the machines, or you can make cars, or you can do nothing. but you can't really turn a factory car into something that will give you food, right? So it affords some things, and technology has a lot to do with redefining the scope of what objects afford you, the use values of objects, right? In a sense, I would even say that the notion of capitalist affordance, like the notion of value affordance, is the notion of use value. Yeah, I think negative externalities, I mean, we could definitely have added this, right? Externality is, it's a weird way of saying something that was excluded from the environment, right? Yeah, I think that I would probably go in the same direction as you, John. You're going out? Okay, see you in a bit. Does it make sense? Like this distinction between, for me, it captures more broadly that, like, if you imagine you have some system and you have some environment, and we're talking about a mode C environment, that means that every object in this space, even though we cannot see its relations directly, right? We know that its connections are codified. If they do relate to each other, they relate by preserving that mode C is the least costly way to do things. So, for example, you don't need to be coerced to work in the morning, because if you don't work, you die. And any other thing that could prevent you from dying is more costly and requires you to go more against the current of the actual space you're in than going to work, because your building is facilitated for you to go down. It has no, garden for you to cultivate plants so you can eat. The bus that goes through your door doesn't take you many places, only takes you to your work. The place when you get to work, it's only good for doing one thing. If you try to do anything else in that space, it doesn't function very well. So everything is conducive to a certain thing and doesn't afford you many other options. And if you want to create those other affordances, you need to spend a lot of effort, right? That's what he calls mute compulsion. The construction of an environment in which the paths for social reproduction are facilitated if they go through the value form, and are blocked if they don't, or at least made much harder if they don't, right? And we would call a niche inside that environment the price tag, right? The price form, because the price form is something that once you interact with it, it interacts through the money commodity with every other thing, and you get a quick view of everything, right? Of the landscape. So, okay. So I'm almost done, guys. Don't worry. Yeah, I only have 3 slides, and now it's just a simple thing. So my idea is that we can use this, right, and to talk about what is the environment way of appearing of each mode. And note that I didn't add this here because I didn't have time, but in our idea, we know that a system is divided between its logical structure, how we decompose things, and its material structure, whereas an environment, these things are not clear. So, for example, if value goes through commodities, right, or if value goes through, as I said, a river, and makes it so that on the other side, you can only clean it up by using money. You can't really use it any other way. Or if you go to the market and, I mean, the only food you can afford is crappy food, because all those options, they no longer distinguish between if they are material constraints in the sense that it's not capitalist, it's just the reality of the material thing in your face, or if it is the logic of the system. Those two things get lumped together, right? That's why it's the material reproduction of social, the material perpetuation of social reproduction, right? So we could explore that more. Why is it that when you engage with the environment, the difference between the material constraints and the idea of social constraints, they get lumped together. You don't see the two, right? So just to conclude, so what I started thinking about is that I'm not sure about this, but I would say something like this. I think that mute compulsion, what Mau is describing, has to do with the built-in environment structure for mode C, right? The thing that is more than your interactions with B and C, which is the thing that you're getting inferences about and that is constraining the environment, right? Implicit norms is pretty much the constraints on a mode A environment, I think, meaning the things you can't really ask A can't ask to B or C, but they are the thing constraining everything. Like, for example, a dirty secret everyone knows nobody can talk about, right? So implicit norms, those are constraints at the level of embarrassment, of dishonor. Like, why aren't you saying something? Well, it's embarrassing to bring it forth. That's an environmental constraint. There's no violence nor ideology. You know very well, you should say it. Nobody's going to prevent you from saying it, and still you don't in an interpersonal situation. What is that constraint, right? That embarrassment, or that kind of, it's a pressure of an implicit norm, right? I know this is important, but I know that preserving some cohesion between people is even more important. That's the environment acting on us, right? And I'm not sure about this term here, but I do think that there is a specific way which is not violence. I think actually, now that I think of it, John actually solved this some time ago. I think probably the correct word here is logistics, which is access to resources, right? For example, if you pass a street or you don't pass a street someplace, things a state does that are materially embedded and constrain you, and it's not state violence. The state is not gonna bring the police on you, right? It's just gonna cut your supply of water. That's a constraint that doesn't have the structure of violence, right? But for example, a concentration camp at an open air prison like Gaza is pretty much not simply under violence when bombs fall. It's under violence all the time. The whole environment is not conducive to living, right? Yeah, I think bureaucracy could say it's a way of looking at how, actually, I'm just going to get to that. I think that's a really good question because, okay, let me just change this because this is just wrong. I think I just recalled this term. I think it's much better. But what I was going to say that has to do with what you just said is that we know that these things here, they are consistent simplifications, right? The world has three logics and it's very complex. And here we get like weird kind of simplifications that forget one logic. And because they forget one logic, they combine the other two in a clearer way, right? So this is a good way of thinking about niches or institutions, right? Because, for example, when you interact with, for example, a bank, the bank is not just an environment. It's not just part of the environment. It has a specific door. It gives you a card. It tells you that you need to do this and that. And through a legal structure, it helps you mediate your relation to money and to the rest of the world. Gets you a manager to tell you how to plan your life. So it's a part of the environment that is simplified with regards to the capitalist world. And it makes that exchange. If you go through me, I facilitate your access to the world, right? But you also get mode A and mode C structures and mode A and mode B structures, like social institutions, like school and hospitals and things like this. They are mode A and mode B. They take care of the community under a certain type of law and the state runs it, right? So you can start getting a better theory of what these intermediary things are that we never managed to describe very well, right? And just to conclude, I'm not going to go into this, but if you go back to the idea of niche, right? I said that a niche, let's say, facilitates your access to something that you could access nevertheless, right? I think that we can also describe what we call surrogate systems in these same terms. A surrogate system is a part of the environment that affords you something you couldn't afford before. So say I'm here and I want to get here, for example, right? In this case here, I'm saying that there was a price P1, but let's say I simply could, it's not an affordable price. I cannot get from X to Y. But if X makes the cost P2, the choice P2, to this part of the environment, this part of the environment takes you there, right? Through some operation. This idea of a share of the environment that allows you to get somewhere that you couldn't get on your own, that idea of surrogacy, right? We can also formalize using this whole thing. And it's all kind of prepared for that. And I will bring this in the last presentation, because the whole cool thing about surrogate systems is that you can use the material constraints of something which is not you to be able to think better than you can on your own, right? So it will lead us to the idea, exactly that something we've been looking for a while, which is the idea that if you are an individual and you engage in an organization, that you would get a better picture of the world than if you're directly going here, right? Well, this picture that we were trying to develop, it pretty much means if an individual is a system and the world is an environment, you are in a certain type of mess. But if you are a component in an organization, and this is the system and this is the environment, you get to see the world in a different way. And if you want to understand in which way the individual is in the organization, which is seeing the world, you can use a surrogate system structure to think about it. You're delegating something to the organization that it can compute and see and discuss better than you can on your own. Right, so that's kind of the direction, one of the directions for the last presentation. Yeah, I just added this crazy image, but this is actually what we just saw now. I don't need to go into it. It just looks complicated. And yeah, I know everyone must be very tired after all of it.
It was really good though. And especially these last few slides, it's gave me a lot of ideas for my presentation next week. But because I'm going to be talking about our old hunting ground of the transformation problem and things like that, and I feel like yeah, we actually covered this. I was watching our very first STP meeting, or one of the very first ones, and it was about this idea of navigating and how capitalist firms navigate space, right?
Yeah,
it has to do with this.
Yeah, I remember Raquel had this idea that people didn't think about competition as something that signaled to capitalists something about the totality, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she had this really cool example of like Eisenstein and like kind of representing capital, like the totality being represented by a part.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it has everything to do with this affordances and niches.
Yeah, I think so too, because you know, we could, for example, say that you have value as the constitutive transcendental. You get price, which is the price form. But then the transformation problem was always about how do you derive prices of production out of the theory of value, and what is the relation between the two? Because once people are operating under prices of production, it seems like you no longer need the idea of value. And then it's this conundrum, right? And we have enough layers to say, well, companies operate under price of production because that's how the environment is constituted for them. They look at the world in terms of, is this an opportunity that affords profit, right? And then you think in terms of profit rates, and profit rates, when you project them back into production, they are the prices of production, right? So it makes sense that a system inside the capitalist world would see its environment in terms of profit opportunities, and then lump them together, compare them, and so on, right? A sort of subjective phenomenology for a company. which is kind of the basis of this whole thing, right? We're kind of moving from objective to subjective phenomenology slowly.
Yeah, it actually pays off this wager we made right at the beginning where we said like, oh, commodities can see each other. They can like, they have their own like kind of subjective space to them. But we didn't really have like enough machinery, I think, at the time to really, it felt more like a metaphor back then. But now I think it's actually a lot more, it feels a lot more fleshed out.
Can you say, Rafa, you mean the Merleau-Ponty in the sense that there is something about like subjective phenomenology to this, right? With the body in it,
yeah, because I think like his whole scheme, it reminds me a lot of this structure, but like in a very more precise manner, because Merleau-Ponty, I think he's also concerned with the black box elements of organic life and the perception, etc. But I think this like makes it a lot clearer, the different elements and the difficulties, and I think it's a move from subjective, from there's a subjective element that appears from this distinction between system and environment that really is, I think there's like a lot of possibilities for goals here. I mean, I'm very excited.
Fantastic
presentation.
Yeah, I really like the fact that it feels that a lot of like French and German kind of post-war philosophy has a really good idea, but goes really fast, and then you don't get to like go step by step, and you're obliged to say that if the body has a relation to its outside, it's already a soul that is a subject. Like sometimes it needs more stuff to get to that point, right? So I feel like with the Merleau-Ponty thing, it's really cool. Like it's clearly an objective subjective phenomenology. Like he doesn't want to assume the subjective. He wants to meet it in the middle of the path, right? But it just seems like it lacks the means to go slowly and build bit by bit. So I think his tools are, I mean, the whole Husserlian tool package is very restricted in that way, because you can only talk about object and subject and the thing which is not the subject or the object, then you give it a third name, the flesh, and then you're stuck, but I agree. I think it's going in that direction, and it's cool because we can recuperate a normal theory of subjectivity that people they normally think about it like an observing system that has some structure and purpose and so on, and keep the Badiou theory of subject of truth, which is something else. We can separate the two things more easily. We can say, no, what you mean is actually what we're talking about when we talk about systems, affordances, or more complex connections with an environment and so on. And we can leave the problem of the subject of truth to what happens with any object, be it a system or a conscious subject or not, if it gets entangled in a truth procedure and so on. I think it should be easier to separate the two things as well a bit.
Yeah, and I think for me this is like one of the most important points of interest, because I think it's in this meeting of subjects, of concepts of subjects, that you have like the problem of the militant relation to the organization. I think there when this is distinguished, and I think that it really allows us to understand the what does it mean to participate in an experimental in politics. I mean,
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get there, but one thing that I thought we can already start doing is, for example, I just mentioned this tree structure, right? There's the inside of the system, which is connected to like the model that the system has of the outside. There is the actual system, and there is the environment, right? There are three places in which you can compose with politically. You can compose at the level of the model. So everyone is not doing anything, but they share a common view. You can compose at the level of the systems in which your actions are composing with other people, or you can compose at the level of the environment. For example, if you're building a land settlement, so we can actually distinguish the ways in which you can build together parts of a movement to compose an organization, right? Organizations are mixtures of people who interact at the level of landscapes or models, systems, and environments.
Yeah, I think this is, yeah, and the different intelligibilities depending, yeah, I think you can like pass more easily into from one to each, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think this
hopefully. So now I'll probably only manage to finish this like in December or something, but I'm gonna start working on that.
No, but good perspectives.
Good.
Okay, folks, I have to leave, but
yeah, me too. Guys, thank you so much.
See you next time.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye, Monica. I'm gonna write you, Monica, about your amazing math. We can talk later. See ya.
Bye.
Bye-bye.